Hello, and welcome to another episode of Phishing for Answers. Today, we've got a very special guest with us today, Kip James here. Now, I'd love to just sort of, from your perspective right out of the gate, how did you get into cybersecurity? Back in when I got into tech, at least, and I imagine for you, cybersecurity wasn't really much of a field.
It's this is I've been in technology for 41 years, and cybersecurity was like a hobby back in the 70s, right? And it was really fun because my brother and I were only attacking each other with the same computer and trying to understand what we did what did we do to create that weakness within the environment. So as I started, getting into IT, when I went to the Marines in 1983, I went to communications. They said, "Hey, do you know computers?" I'm like, "Yeah, I used to build them a lot." So that's where it started, right? 1983 is started working with the 8088s, right? And the 8086s, which is just a terminal. And then we started growing. So to make a long story very short, when I got out, when I retired out of the Marines in 2003, officially was my first cybersecurity position, even though I taught it in the military, right? I taught we only allow what we need. When I got out, I worked for the Bureau of Reclamation, and I was an entry level security analyst. So I had all this background, 20 years of background of IT, but that's how I eventually got into being truly, focusing on security as much as I could.
Oh, that's an awesome story. Uh, Mine's a little bit different. I taught myself to hack back in high school and realized it might be a bad skill set to have, and that I didn't want to go down Mitnick's path at the time. Because this was right during the free Mitnick days, and I actually got sued for hacking. We don't need to go into that, but it put me on the straight and narrow, and I got out of it for a long time. And then one day I stumbled across Backtrack Linux and learned
Oh
about
my goodness, yeah.
testing, and I was like, okay, I quit my job. I'm moving into this, and no joke, I quit that day and switched over to cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's just cybersecurity back in the early 80s was more of like, mainframe access and mainframe controls. So the first mainframe I ever worked on was Wang computers back in '86. So that was interesting, is learning how that functioned, which helped me grow.
Cybersecurity and 1986 in the same sentence almost sound like an oxymoron. Wasn't a whole lot of cybersecurity back then.
No, it existed. It existed. It's like you learned principles of building technology back in I can't say in the 70s, but when I started learning the least privilege access method,
Yeah.
That was learned back in the 80s, right? So you only provided the access of what someone needed. And that's where the first foundation where I started doing it. But professionally, I started doing it, in cybersecurity in 2003 professionally, as is literally going into it really deep, right? I knew the concepts, I knew all of the core things. I know what you're talking about, hacking, creating my own viruses. But it was fun. It was more of a hobby rather than a professional type of atmosphere at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably should never admit this, but I may or may not have gotten in trouble for making fake viruses when I was in high school just to scare the librarians. I don't know why, but but we were all young once. Now, on a more serious note, though, as you've gotten into your career, what part of cybersecurity have you really enjoyed the most? Like, where's your passion inside of this industry?
Yes. I mean,
Yes.
it's literally everywhere. Being a CISO, you brief executives of where things are in an organization. But I mean, I'm literally my entire career. I've been a developer. I've been a sysad. I've been a network ad. Been a SOC analyst. Been a you name it, not really database is the only thing that I really didn't go into that much, but literally everything security, I just enjoy. I mean, I
Yeah.
really, really enjoy security. So there wasn't anything that I was, oh, I like this. It's like, okay, what piques my interest today? It's more of that having us even keel across the board to understand what's happening. Um, it's, if you said, okay, Kip, under duress and waterboarding, what would you
Got a
think of?
gun to your head.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is, how did I write something that discovers a weakness within an environment, right? So for one company, the disastigs is literally a checklist. Do I have it on or off, right? And I got tired of doing that. So I said, okay, I don't feel like answering the same question as far as the compensating control. So what I did is I created an efficiency that says, okay, let me load the results. I know what the standard answer is going to be, because it's not going to change based off the environment we were building. It's not going to change, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to
Yeah.
change those controls. So I got to create a database and loaded my information in there, exported the output of all of my standard answers, and kept on handing it over to the DoD. So if you ask for what's my biggest thing, is building efficiencies within security, rather than saying, okay, what's this one thing that I have to fix, rather than looking at what the systemic view is. So that's
All the people that I've got a ton of people from Huntsville here that are their job is RMF, and they live and breathe that. So I wouldn't be surprised if you get hit up for some of those efficiencies.
well, some of these. This is only one rack, but some of these are what I got for efficiencies.
Oh, that's awesome. No, I joke. That's very cool. I think for me, my passion, interestingly enough, has really grown around the human. And I say that because when I first got into this, I say interesting rather, because when I first got into this, I wanted to be the most technical hacker in the world. I'm never going to use social engineering. And then, no joke, the very first physical engagement that I get, I'm able to talk my way into a bank vault. And so at that point, I'm like, well, maybe I should consider social engineering. That was a lot of fun. And it just led me down this path. And I mean, got to do some of the most amazing stuff in the world. Like, I watched a NBA game from the game operations center, standing next to the general manager of the team. No one thought to ask me why I was there. Once got an opportunity to actually got into a casino money cage. I mean, and so some of those things were just amazing. But I think getting in is easy, defending is hard, and because you only have to get right once to break in. To really keep the bad guys out, you have to be right all the time. And so for me, that's where my passion naturally led over to the defensive side, and really the question of how do we use social engineering as a form of defense, or as for good. And so with that, it really just led me to down the rabbit hole that is behavioral science. But there's so much that can be applied to that. What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned from a human perspective throughout your career?
Oh my gosh. Um, Now I worked at embassies, so the physical aspect of it, as far as you never trust anybody. Yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the elements. Is I really don't. I trust people as a person I'm dealing with, but I don't trust person as far as what their capability may be, right? If that makes any sense. It's more of like, everybody can have a great facade up front, but they may have a dirty side on the backside, right? So it's just always have trust but verify is the biggest thing that I've always learned. And when you talk about behavioral and you talk about social engineering, is that, to go back to your earlier question, what is my focus? I focus on the hard, not the easy, because the easy has to be repetitive, right? It has to be
Yeah.
always, all the time. So you build a program that's constantly reiterating, not for overconsumption of time, right? Or inundating somebody with a bunch of information, but strategically and tactically address those things by informing people what they need to do, or what to identify certain things. And the biggest thing that I've learned is the human is always going to be the weakest link, no matter which way you look at it. And I'll give you an example: is passwords, and this is like shooting fish in a barrel. But passwords was I would say, okay, your password has to be 8 characters, 9 characters. Remember the Solaris 8 days. It says 8. Oh, guess what? Go to 9. It goes back to the first digit. So I was inspecting a group of people this is in the Marines, and I kept on seeing some guy go like this, lean back and look up. I'm like, what the heck is this guy? He just kept on repeating to do that. He had his password behind the light that was up in the ceiling, right? So it's like the weakness is the person, right? So people this social engineering is really, 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 really simple, because people are like electricity. They'll take the least path of resistance, right? 100% of the time. I don't care who you are.
I mean, I agree that that across the board, that's the area that we all have the greatest sort of exposure, is around our people, because you're right. I mean, they often will, and the bad guys, they understand these cognitive biases or mental shortcuts that we use to quickly make decisions, and unfortunately those can be used against us to manipulate us into doing things.
Right.
So along that line, before we really jump into the defensive side and how do we get better results out of our people and how do we measure it, do you have any other sort of fun social engineering or human stories to, just sort of really articulate the problem and provide some, maybe entertainment value?
I don't know about entertainment, but the entertainment was the guy looking up at the light to figure out the password.
That is entertaining.
That was pretty entertaining. I mean, you bring up subject of social engineering or people doing things. I have no idea who the guy is, but he's always at these social events, and I'm talking with a bunch of cameras around, not really caring about anything. It's not something personal. This is just one reference, and I'll go into my experiences. But the guy is showing up everywhere in Hollywood at all of these big functions that you have to have an engraved black thing, like the Count of Monte Cristo, little black envelope. You're cordially invited. He shows up no matter what. So, I don't have anything exciting as that. But what we ended up doing was, in one company, is we were assessing the access controls of a password reset, right?
Yeah.
So there's, right now you have the Social Security Administration that basically got completely breached, right? So it's literally has all of these Social Security numbers in. So I have one element there, right? Then a birthday is really, really easy to find out, right? You can go on to whitepages.com and you can find out, oh, the guy's 50 years old, the guy's 60 years old, whatever. Then you start doing a little bit more history. So what we were trying to do was, how far can we go in an organization? And this is I'm very genericizing, and obviously, but there's, in this organization, we started to say, how many elements would it take for us to get a password reset or to get something changed within the organization? And it's really, really simple. So it took the person that came in, he knew the social security number of the person. He knew where the person lived. He knew the person's phone number. He knew the person's birthday. So how do you block it?
Yeah, and I mean, and particularly these hacker groups, they have every data breach that they're searching through, and it's, you quickly correlate that data, and I mean, just trigger on an email address alone, and it's amazing the amount of data that we can get on people, particularly in the U.S. where we don't respect privacy.
Mhm.
It's interesting. I've done assessments in more than one country, and the level of privacy in other countries is significantly greater than what we see
Oh,
here. And
absolutely.
some of those OSINT tactics don't work like they do in other countries. But it's incredible. Okay, so my focus is really around the how do we get better performance out of our people? How do we really drive that culture change? Um, any sort of tips or lessons you've learned along the years that you'd want to share?
Oh, absolutely. There's, I kind of mentioned it, is that how do you educate someone without inundating them, right? With a
Yeah,
whole bunch of information. That's really, really key. And what was the most effective method for me was I like to talk to people. I like to get
yeah,
out into the organization and say, I don't want to be sitting inside of a place and say I'm the Crystal Palace, blah, blah, blah. What I want to do is be with the people, right? And I make it very simplistic. So in in different environments, depending on who you're talking to, you have to model their understanding of technology,
yeah,
and making sure that who you're talking to, you don't make it so simple that they don't that it's so simple that they get bored, but you make it entertaining for them, right? So one of the areas what I would do is I would go into, this is when I was international, right? I would travel international, and I would say, have a group of people come in, anywhere from about 50 to about 400 or 500 people, and I would be in the front just talking to them. And rather than just standing in the front, I would go in the audience and walk in the audience and start talking to people, because I'm showing them that it's interactive. And I would ask a question relevant to that individual or relevant to that particular country that I was dealing with. One of the areas that I did is I said, you were talking about cybersecurity, and cybersecurity is really important for an organization. But let me give you a word of advice or teach you something that is personal to yourself,
yeah.
right? And I said,
Connected, make it so that they understand what the
ex-
impact is.
exactly. So I said, anybody have a credit card in here? Just hold your credit card up. And I was like, oh man, that's a really cool credit card. Hey, can I have it? And sometimes, honestly, I would get I would get the card in my hand. I would look at him. I'm like, really? Like, the thing is, you don't know if I have a photographic memory. He said,
No, no, you
you don't have
don't.
everything on your card right now.
Yeah.
And I said, that's one of the things that you have to do. Make sure that you're controlling your information, that it's yours, right? You don't want someone to take advantage and empty your bank account. You
Yeah.
don't you don't want to do that, right? You don't want to share too much information about yourself when you're only trying, buying a gallon of gas or something, right? You give them the money, you walk away. You don't say, oh, by the way, I'm over here. I'm not home very often. I'm home Tuesday, Thursday, Fridays. Guess what? Come rob me on Wednesday, right? So it depends on the audience, depends on the country, depends on how people act as far as trust relationships, right?
Yeah.
Um,
But people
yeah.
overshare all the time.
Oh,
And that's one of the core things of social engineering is getting people to overshare. That's actually how I won the SECTF one time, was getting people to overshare.
absolutely, absolutely. So that was one of the methods that I used to make sure. I mean, the other is communications. Oh, let me send an email out, say, hey, don't, by the way, we're being hit by this particular attacker. This is with the method that they're doing. That's not effective at all, right?
No.
Do they read it? Probably not. Do they open it no matter what? Yeah, that's what I guess when phishing comes into play. So
Right?
yeah, it's like, I will tell you a funny story that I had a person come to me and says, Kip, I was dumb. I was like, what did
Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
what did you do? Well, I had someone say that I had a virus on my computer. You've seen those 100 times, right?
uh, yeah.
And I'm like, oh my goodness, please tell me you didn't click on it. Yes, I clicked on it. And I was like, I got a hold of I got a hold of I got a hold of the representative, and I was like, okay, what did the representative ask? Oh, I need to install some stuff on your on your computer. As soon as they did that,
No.
as soon as they did that, I said, please tell me you hung up. She says, yes, because I scared. I unplugged my computer, shut it, clamshelled it, brought it over to your house.
Good.
There were five remote software on the poor individual's computer. And every time it would reboot, ding.
Oh man. So
That
I've
hasn't happened
gotten,
once. That's happened many times that I'm fixing people's computers because they did something like that.
I can't tell you how many times I get phone calls and like I got a phone call from my dad, like, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. And in the background, I hear you've got malware. And I'm like, wait a second, what? Don't click.
My dad did the same thing, and he was like, and so and my biological mother calls me. She says, "Is this real?" I mean, literally, I get texts every day from her. Is this
Yeah.
real?
Yeah.
Fake. I have an auto reply now. Fake, fake, fake.
Oh, that's great. But I couldn't agree more about bringing it home. They have to understand how cybersecurity matters, why it matters to them. And so the more we can connect it, like, hey, you want to be able to get a mortgage, right? You want to be able to get that car loan, right? The more effective it can be. In fact, I was talking yesterday with BZ, the Navy Reserve Cyber Warfare Commander, and that was exactly what he was talking about. Was, how we've got to connect it and bring it home to them. So yeah, 100%. And not overwhelming them, I think, is another critical thing, because so often we take our worst communicators, some of our best cybersecurity people, but often our worst communicators, and we put them in charge of our most critical and difficult communications task that I think almost any corporation ever faces, or organizations in general. And so it really leads to us overcomplicating, because we are in the weeds. The cybersecurity people are so often in the weeds that if you tell them to, talk about phishing, they're going to be like, well, here are 12 different ways to identify a fish, and here's how you go and look at the headers, and they'll get into stuff that is way too complex. And when you get the average user that thinks, well, it's too complex for me to understand it, and then you make it too complex, you've just proved them right. And I feel like most of what we do falls on deaf ears.
Mm-hmm. It does. It does, because it's when I was dealing with lawyers, they're like, Kip, translate from Kipanese to legalese. So, and it was more of, and it was a not a, I wouldn't say a rude awakening, because it was very polite, but it was more of like, you need to dumb it down, right? Because it was, now this is 20 years ago, is that I would explain something to my father, and he's he was 70 years old, 80 years old, and was just an executive in business.
Yeah.
He didn't know anything about technology. So the thing that always fluttered in the back of my head was, remember, you're talking to your dad and explaining something very simplistically, not to the point that, okay, big dog, red dog run or something like that, but more of, let's talk about how do you identify something that's reflective to how that person thinks, right? Remember, I said at the very beginning, understand your audience before you start to work things. So if I'm talking to a group of engineers, and it could be IT engineers, it could be electrical engineers, depending on, I've been to a bunch of different industries, is I look at the audience and say, okay, how do I talk to them in a different way, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it makes it easier so that your audience can consume what you're saying, but don't make it. I literally had this conversation today, and I said, don't give me a dissertation, but give me something that's bullets, that it's really simple to read, really simple to understand. And you don't have to give any explanation, because some of those things can be understood. Kids live in these things today, right?
They do.
So, and well, I'm not going to say kids anymore, because the millennials are in their 30s and 40s, right? So, so those devices is you articulate it in how they use their device.
Yep. So I like what you said about, think about who you're going after. So studies have shown that if you can tie things to the context or the role of the job that person's doing, that training is 10 times more effective. So along the lines of role-based training, I know it's one of those things that a lot of people talk about. Almost nobody does. But the role-based training, what roles should we be covering? And to that, since you've got the government background, the new CMMC requirements say role-based training, but they don't define any roles. So I guess we're supposed to define this ourselves. Two
Well,
big questions there, but what are your thoughts around that?
well, let's talk about CMCC. CMCC is a risk-based framework that allows you to evaluate the risks to the organization before you take an action. That's what it is, right? It's ISO
Yeah,
27001
it is.
in a military in a military format. So if we look at that, oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, ask the question one more time.
Oh, it's okay. I was asking about CMMC because one of the requirements in there
Oh, yeah.
indicates role-based training, but they really don't go into any details about what that is.
So in typical format is that they want to see what people come up with, evaluate all of the individual items, and then pick one. So it'll come eventually, but it's because CMCC is what, 2 years old now, I think, maybe 3 at the greatest. Is that there's a lot of things that have to be learned of role-based access, or I'm not going to say role-based access, role-based training programs.
Yeah.
Because I still don't think that people really understand, a RACI model across a technology group, across a finance group, across all of these different individual groups. I think they understand from an individual contributor to a manager to an executive, right?
Yeah.
I think they understand that model, but they don't understand the granularity between an IT executive and a finance executive or a COO, right?
Yeah.
Say operations, right? So I think that it's going to take time to kind of create those controls. But because there's so much diversity within from one organization to another, it's really going to come up down to custom, and they'll come up with these general principles that you need to follow. And then they'll say, okay, here's the principles you have to follow, but it'll never be exact, ever. Not in my opinion.
Probably not. But along the lines of roles, I think regardless of any frameworks, a lot of people are looking at it, and in particular finance, because I think that's the one role that keeps us all up at night. What if they send $1 million wire? So, but what roles should we be looking at as we, in your opinion, as an executive in this industry?
Wow. That's a really hard question because, you even made the comment and you affirmed that the comment was true. It only takes one, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if it depends on what the scenario is, as far as the role-based training. I mean, if you say, okay, let me go to the masses, then you're going to go to your individual contributors, and make sure that they understand, I think, well, I'm not going to say executives know because I see too much of evidence of the contrary, but there's, wow. I think, let me rephrase my statement a little bit, as far as I'm going to address it a different way. I think the roles should be based off of the levels of group that's understood today, right? Individual contributor, manager, executive. I think that's what we should focus on first. Who should we stay on first? I'm telling you right now that the by the masses, the individual contributor contribute a large amount of issues, as far as they're not concentrating, they're really young, they're clicking on just about anything they can click on, while an executive may look at something and says, oh, by the way, I'm in finance, I'm expecting our a spreadsheet filled with all of our numbers for each individual business units, right? So there's there's two ways to address it. I think that you address it specifically in different categories, meaning that I'm going to focus on the general person that wants to click on everything, right? And
Yeah.
then I would go into the managers and says, okay, they're starting to learn the maturity of operating within an IT system or a corporation. And then go to the executive and says, I'm already expecting something, but is this the right thing? Should I be clicking on? Is this something I expected from this particular person or this particular format or whatever? And then those things, I think that's the way it should be addressed, but not say I'm gonna have a priority on this or this or this and this, because
Yeah.
like you said, it only takes one, right? But you build the models based off of those three groups in general.
Okay, that makes sense. So phishing plays a critical role in education for almost every organization these days.
Mhm.
Uh, what, in your opinion, or I guess what frequency, in your opinion, should we be phishing our users at? And a follow-up question to that is, do you have any recommendations in terms of best practices around that?
Uh, so we fish 50,000. Well, I'm not going to say we fish 50,000. We fish out of, we're about 50 to 60,000, depending on what time of, um, what part of the year we're in.
Okay.
And we, not everybody has email. So, we roughly at least 30, 40,000 people. And we try to run it. Our method is, let me fish you once a year. But if you fail any one of the phishing exercises, you're sent to training. So it's basically, you're rewarding the people that have identified the right fish. Then you're saying, okay, we're not penalizing them, but we're trying to teach them, right? What are they doing? And then they have three chances, and eventually, HR gets involved and says, okay, look, you failed it 4 times. What are we not doing right? So rather than penalizing the person financially, right? We look at that and says, okay, what are we not doing right? Right. So learn from your exercises. So to answer your question, once a year at least, because it's such a large population, I can't constantly hit everybody. We do have segmentation between an individual contributor and executive. We don't have the managers; they're kind of looped in with the individual contributors, but we do have targeted executive phishing emails that go to the executives, right? And that's not only here; it's been in the last, since 2008. I've deployed the same model in all of the companies I've been with to make sure that we're addressing where we have seen the weaknesses in the individual organizations. So if I see an executive is failing the annual thing, I'll hit the person again, even if they pass the first one, maybe in a quarter, maybe in semi-annually. I'll craft a special email to teach them a little bit more of how do you identify something that's bad, right?
Yeah.
And I like to play a lot of games with phishing. So, but that's the method is at least get them to understand an exercise. In smaller organizations, you can do a little bit more frequently, but if you do it too much, it's going to make them numb, and possibly slip.
So I like that, the breaking it up into subgroups, because we're already seeing that role-based phishing in the wild, not from a defensive or tools perspective, but just what's coming in against our people. It knows our organizational structure, it understands our role in the organization, and it's contextual, leading to no other conclusion than this was built by AI. What are you seeing in terms of AI-driven attacks targeting your organizations that you work to protect?
We're not seeing too many AI created items. We're seeing more of targeted, I know your infrastructure, I know who you are, I know what's everything. I'm not seeing, I'm not seeing generative AI at all, right? I'm not seeing the manipulation and changing as I hit you the first time, I'm going to change it to see something else. We're not necessarily seeing that right now. The I think what we're seeing. Oh, by the way, this, I have your seat. I'm talking as I'm sending an email as the CEO. Hey, CEO, and it has the full name of the CEO, and the CEO never says that. Like
Yeah,
people,
the fake chain email
yeah,
fish.
yeah. That's what we're seeing mostly of.
I'm
Um,
convinced those are being generated by AI,
Seriously.
'cause, well, on our end, when we so, I run a fishing simulation company,
Yep.
and so we are endlessly trying to figure out how to do these same things, so that we can simulate them, and for our users for a purpose of education, and that was the only way that we were able to figure out that part and being able to dynamically generate those. So,
Well, it's
I know at least for us, it's generative AI to be able to do that particular attack. And that's one of our first production uses of generative AI too.
I think it's more of ML. I think they're learning at the very beginning. I don't think it's changing based off of behavior yet, because there's not enough. It's if you're fished, there's feedback, right? If you're not fished,
Yeah.
and you don't click on you don't open the email, there's not enough information to one piece of information can give you some type of generative AI response.
Yeah.
But where the value is you get a lot of responses, right? So that you can tune your, the best way to do an analogy would be I'm going from 1080p to 4K, right?
Yeah.
So if you have enough information that's gathered on a response, then I can go to a better picture, right?
Yeah.
Um,
I think machine learning or LLM, they're definitely getting smarter as the
I think they're taking the results of the ML and LLM to give you more of a tuned aspect of the attack rather than something that is, oh, you need to pay your bill, signed gmail.com. So
yeah,
rather,
no, I could see that.
I literally got one yesterday, or no, I'm sorry, last week. And I looked at the URL, right? Just basic, the first basic things that you do is kind of, oh, where's it coming from? And then do I really expect it? And it said Microsoft.com. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Let me look at the source. And the source was masked, right? So it basically converted from what the source was to Microsoft.com. But when you hovered over it, it still said Microsoft.com, which was amazing, which was pretty cool.
Oh,
Which,
wow.
to answer your question,
Hmm.
that is generative AI. Because
Uh,
rather than saying from Google, it's from somewhere else.
so on the topic of AI, it's changing everything in the technology
Oh, yes.
landscape.
Oh, yeah.
I know that people have been saying it's going to take over since 1958, but it's actually taking over. Well, I don't think it's really taking over, but it is revolutionizing technology.
Mhm.
With it comes a lot of new risk. So, what should we be educating our users about when it comes to AI? And are there any core elements that we need to add to our awareness programs to address the threat? And I ask because I hear a lot of different answers on this question, and it seems that everyone's seeing the risk of AI from a slightly different perspective. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Oh my goodness, it's so TTEC. We actually have something called the Rake, which is the Responsible AI Committee. And what's interesting is I've learned a lot from that perspective. But in the course of AI, is if you use AI and you put information that's your personal information or company information, it could be reused to learn more about. And that's what we try to teach the individuals is that look, anything you put in there at all may be used to learn the model so that it becomes more mature. Now
Yeah,
that's good and that's bad, right?
it is.
But it's just like we talked about earlier as an attacker, the attacker is getting, they're correlating all this data, they're pulling all of this data, these exploit information and putting it together.
Yeah.
Using AI, it's going to go 10 times faster because you're putting information. Tell me if my password has ever been used. Boop. Guess what? If it was a great password, it's now part of a registry somewhere that can be used in the future cases. So it's like literally teaching them the thing. It goes back to giving them the personal element. Is tell me if my credit card number has ever been used. Boop, I'm done. Now your credit card's somewhere else, right? And it's being learned as a model. It's also learning behaviors. How does someone, okay, real simple one. Go to Amazon.com, buy 5 things. What's the next advertisement you get? Probably something that relates to one of those 5 items you just purchased, right? That's
100%.
really That's really powerful. And the risk is, if you continue to do that model, you're now going to modify your mind into things that you may not want. Really simple things is that it modifies the mind. It doesn't, it's AI is going to reduce the creativity of of an organization, because it's going to create based off of something it already knows, not something it's going to generally create itself.
I could see that. Um, but to that regard, I don't see us getting around it. I mean,
No.
regardless of increasing or decreasing creativity, I think it's here to stay.
Mhm.
Would you agree? So
I agree on that. I agree on that point. But the point, to point your question, to answer your question more directly, is that the teaching that you have to teach people about using AI, other than saying use it responsibly. Okay,
yeah,
what does that mean, right? So, teaching them that, any information you put in there is used to create other things.
that
And
makes
if you
sense.
and if you create, for example, I'll just use TTEC as an example. If you start entering all of the information about TTEC, it's now going to have a profile that's not public. It's supposed to be private to TTEC. It's confidential information.
Yeah,
So to reflect it to a personal use, don't enter your credit card, don't enter your birthday, don't enter your name. I mean, just, ask it general questions, right? So, right now I'm using it to help me figure out problems in my code. I'm writing Python scripts and I have a problem and I'm like, oh, let me go to Gemini, let me go to Copilot, let me go to something that's going to help me figure that out. But
yeah,
the
yeah.
key thing is that I'm never talking about anything that would be part of my professional personal life. It's just I'm looking up something.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. I think privacy issues will be more and more mitigated by edge AI. But I also think those same edge AI capabilities, as they advance, are going to be deployed inside of malware
Yeah.
to make it that much more adaptive, that much more intelligent. Um, so, I think that those are the other sort of dangers. But right now, models are massive. So, unless I'm tapping into a model that already exists on your computer, I don't see loading up a model as part of my malware without you identifying it. Not yet.
Not
Not yet.
yeah, not yet. I mean, it's it depends on how you deploy your malware.
I like it. I
Why is
like
why is my malware referencing out to ChatGPT? I don't have any ChatGPT on my computer.
it.
Why is my CPU going up? Oh, and it's to Copilot. Oh, really? What am I running in Copilot?
I'll tell you what I've been using it for is we're a Google Workspace company, and I have been writing app scripts like crazy. All of these redundant things I can completely eliminate. I've created tools. I don't know. It's been my weekend hobby for a little while here. I love letting ChatGPT code for me. It's not bad.
It's well, it so I've been doing the same thing on my own, right? Trying to create some of the automation that I want to use. I
Yeah.
try not to do it for work because I'd rather use something else. But I try to create all of these automations because it just takes too long to do something that, it goes back to my Lockheed Martin days in 2007, is creating an efficiency. How do I create an efficiency within an organization that allows me to build what I need
Hmm.
without it exposing the company? That's a great thing to teach people, is that, hey, these tools are really, really fantastic, but you have to be careful of how you engineer these things. Don't
Yeah.
copy your code that has all of the sensitive data or something you want to create a patent on, because once you enter into AI, when you start researching your patent, you're going to say, oh, by the way, my code exists over here.
Yep. And I think another thing with it is being aware of biases. These
Oh,
AIs inherently have biases, not on
mhm.
purpose, but because we as people have biases, and we're going to program them in. If we develop it, we develop it with biases. And so I think that's another area, is to make sure that people really, really understand how dangerous automated decision making can be, particularly in the early days while everyone's trying to put AI into everything.
Mhm.
I do feel like there's a little bit of an overreaction to it, but there's a lot of good that's coming out of it too.
Yeah, we literally had a conversation last week that um, it was they were calling it AI, but it's ML, that they were running resumes through it to find out what the keywords were to find out how well a candidate fits in a position. And the issue is that it can be biased, exactly what you said. Now, it was looking for keywords specific to the position, but not considering anything else, right? There's
Yeah.
other elements, length of time, how long you've been there, all of these other things that should be considered within that. So if you don't understand how AI is being built out and how has it been ingested, how is it learned? To your point, is that a human being is going to program this, and we're going to contingently enter information. Generative AI is going to take based off of the statistical analysis of what's the best answer, right? Which gives us our bias, is going to give us that output. To your point, I think it's great. I think it's fantastic, but you have to understand the full thing of what does it do? Does it consider all of the elements that you want to have considered?
Well, and I think another consideration is how much LLM generated content is being fed back into trained models.
Mhm.
There were at least a certain percentage. I forgot it. I saw this research paper that had looked at academic published articles
Mhm.
and or research, and they actually found that there were a handful that didn't even remove the GPT prompts before they published them. Um, and so, the question then remains, and that they were asking is, well, if we're feeding all of this GPT, generated content in to train GPT, then it's essentially training itself, and we are headed down a very slippery slope. So,
Fox in the hen house. That's all I hear.
yeah. So, there's a lot of talk about closing Pandora's box. What do you think we need in terms of legislation around AI?
Oh, I want to say something, but I shouldn't. But it's more of like it's more like following the EU rules.
I was going to say following Germany.
Yeah, Germany. Well, I'm saying EU, so it's just that, in general sense, they have a better sense of responsibility, right? Because I mean, GDPR came out, and then all of a sudden you have California come out, which almost models GDPR, right? Then you have New York law come out saying the same type of thing. So it's to close Pandora's box. I mean, we have to have within the United States have stronger policy, stronger things around privacy information, right? I'm going to leave that pretty generally set. Until that happens, all of these models are going to learn all of these things that we don't want it to learn. And my fear is, how are we going to extract that? I don't think we ever will, but how do we extract that information that we don't want, to be populated like that?
Yeah. And I mean, we had regression training with large language models, but we don't have the same level of regression training. I'm sorry, we had regression training with machine learning, but not the same level of regression training with these large language models.
Yeah.
In fact, there's some element of still learning exactly how they function. I read an article about how they were able to trace specific patterns to tune up or down elements of the creativity.
You should share that. You should share that article. That'd be fantastic to read.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'll find that and share it with you. So I have found that just about everyone in cybersecurity has a pet peeve or 10 or 20. Do you have any pet peeves in cybersecurity that you want to talk about? This is your soapbox. So
Um, my biggest pet peeve is accountability. Take accountability for your own self. Take accountability for your team. Take accountability. That's my largest and biggest pet peeve, right? No matter what organization I've been, is that it's always the other guy, right? And it's like, I said, before you point the finger in one direction, you have three fingers pointing back at yourself. Look at yourself first before you start pointing. That's my biggest pet peeve.
yeah,
In a technology world, the other pet peeve is I created a team that did research. And my other pet peeve is, why don't you build something and have the permissions around that allows you to do least privilege access? What does that person really need? And I'm not saying this switch or that switch or that switch, depending what the switches are, it may be important, right? But take a deeper look as far as, I'm such a model of, the model that I kind of look at is the DISA model, right? Or the STIG model. And the STIG model is really the core essence of least privilege access. And I think that there's so many people out there that, let me just open the box, let me install the software, and not think about any of the other, things that should be done from a security perspective. But rather than doing that, why don't you build it from a ground? I'm trying to remember the software that came out that was, that the operating system was least privileged access. It's like, what do you need? Okay, I'll put it this way: Docker, right? Docker is the core element of what's needed. What's the least amount of things that are needed to run a container?
Yeah.
And I think if people would start to think that way, I think our environment, our security profile, people would be a heck of a lot more safe.
I completely agree. Least privilege and really just baking security in from the ground up. I spent enough time doing application security hacking for the government to realize that STIG model or not, it's not being done 9 times out of 10. But I don't blame the developers. I truly don't, because there's not enough cybersecurity education for anyone, even younger than me, but my age or above. There was no cybersecurity training in most people's educations around technology. You learned how to develop, and probably not even a good language, like Delphi or something. Yeah. but it is such a critical element. And so, back to that role-based training, I think that's one of those roles that's incredibly critical, that we're constantly training them. Okay, here are best practices. Here's how you develop a secure application, as well.
One of the things I do preach is the OSI model, right? But you have layer 1 through 6 is fairly easy and it can be simple to do. There's a lot of things that you have to do it. The application model is like this, right? Because you have so many different variations. And what I try to teach people is that, okay, you're creating an app. What does the app do? It has a backend database. It has a front end. So I get them to create and think about, what do I want to communicate on, right? Yeah. That's the biggest problem that I see, is that rather than creating an application that only communicates what you need, they're like, oh, let me just create the app so I can have these other methods of communication, without understanding the security behind how do you close it up. I'm giving a very generic answer, but then you go into libraries, you go into everything else, right? So, but that's what I try to make sure that, I every time I talk to a software developer, what are you building? How are you building it? What are you talking to? What do you want to do? What's your receptions? What's your validations, right? A lot of things within DoD right now, and some is how are you guaranteeing or making sure that the data that I'm sending is the data that I've received.
Well, and I think threat modeling is such a critical part that so often isn't being done when we're planning out these applications or building them. And I mean, I have a software company, and I'm the one cracking the whip, I guess, figuratively, to get these things done in time.
Right.
And occasionally our architects will call me like, what the heck are they trying to do?
Software or software network? What? Which architect?
Software in this one. But no, that reminds me of the early days of cloud computing, when Booz Allen accidentally exposed 60,000 sensitive or classified documents.
There were bucket permissions.
Yeah, just wide open bucket, and that's that's what you're saying, is know what you're doing before you do it. So yeah, that's valid. My bigger pet peeve is
write down how your house is going to be built. You need a foundation first. Then you need some columns. Then you need some braces.
Oh, and I do think it all starts with planning and understanding what your goals are. And I see so often, even in cybersecurity, where that part gets forgotten, where we're doing security awareness training to educate people. We're fishing to educate people, but then we forget that we're trying to educate them, and we go off the path of how well can we exploit them, which is great, and it tells us a great deal about our risk, but it doesn't do a whole lot to educate them.
Right.
And so, I see opportunities like that. Any sort of closing thoughts that you'd like to leave with the audience today?
I mean, if we go back through the entire conversation that we had, I mean, and I may end up going backwards rather than forwards, but understand what you're doing, right? Create something that's least privilege access.
Yeah.
Teach people based off of who you're talking to. It's really important. Just don't. And the last thing I would say, just don't mandate from on high. Get into the population and actually be seen, and actually have conversations that are relevant to the individual. Now, if you teach the individual how to be responsible for themselves, overall, what's going to end up happening that will translate into how they're actually functioning in business. And it was really successful in a couple of companies that I've been in, and making sure that when I have those conversations, I'm making it relevant to them rather than just relevant to how it's going to make the company more successful. It automatically translates. It really does.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I've really enjoyed it. You clearly have just a vast amount of experience. I wish we had more time to talk about more stuff here. Maybe I'll have you back on, because we've just begun to scratch the surface here, and just really good advice. Thank you so much for joining us today. Everybody, have a great weekend, and thank you for joining us at